Hello, everybody. Today I'm joined by Ash Barker, and we're here to talk about his latest project, which is Gamma Wolves. So, mech combat in an apocalyptic future. So,
Yeah.
Ash, pleasure to have you on the show.
Thanks. Pleasure to be here.
I suppose the first thing I have to ask is, why do you hate the Earth so much that you keep setting everything in a post-apocalyptic future?
Well, I mean, despite the obvious direction we're heading,
Oh, well, yeah. There is
the
that, I suppose.
I think both of you have enough gray in our hair that we're allowed to say that ironically.
Hmm.
The reason typically is that when you want to do something that's fairly open-ended,
Mhm.
sort of like pushing the reset button on all the conventional things that people know is a really handy way of doing it. So you have to do either one of two things. You can either completely invent your own world, and that sounds like an incredibly big amount of work to me, and I'm not interested in doing a lot of work. Or you can just take the world we live in and just hit the like flip the table over basically and say, no, we're just doing this thing that you already know, but we're gonna tack on a different sort of like end game that's gonna set it up a different way so that we can have a different sort of like look at things.
All for that.
And that's and well, I take so much of my inspiration from, as most people do, I think, the media I've consumed over my life, the books I've read, the comic books I've read, the movies I've watched, the TV I've watched, the stories I've heard from friends, the adventures I've been on myself. That it's just kind of logical to set everything in the world that we actually live in and just kind of take the story to that next step. And so Gamma Wolves was as a lot of like stuff that I do is the outshoot of a dinner conversation with a bunch of other people that are like-minded gamers. It was at Adepticon 2018. I was sitting around with a bunch of the other indie game designer guys that we've kind of formed like a little family group at conventions where we all kind of get together and hang out afterwards and talk about the various challenges of typically being a one-man business or a sole proprietor or working on your own.
There's safety in numbers.
Yeah, the no safety net folks all get together and we all lament with each other and stuff. And we were talking about, well, what is it that piques the interest of people with games, and what games have we seen recently that have really taken off? Because in the last 10 years, there hasn't been like a really hot new game that was an original property. The one really hot title, like where we saw it, where everyone was talking about it, and it was a huge thing, was XWing. And that we talked about was more a product design thing than a like intentional like new idea thing, because that was the ultimate Christmas morning test pass where like you could just open the box and be playing like immediately, and it was this beloved IP, and it was just lightning in a bottle, right?
Yeah, and we were talking everywhere, I suppose, as well. People weren't having to go out of their way to find it in a game store. Even non-gamers could stumble into it in
that's right.
bookshops and all over.
It sold so fast, and distributors were fighting each other to get copies to try and keep selling it. That hasn't happened a lot in the last decade. Like that's the one game I can think of where that's really captured the imagination of hobbyists. And I think it was that idea that young boys and girls have all chased each other around with little model cars and airplanes at some point as kids, and it kind of unlocked that in us and said, hey, oh my gosh, here's this like button that got pushed and we all got excited about it. And we saw it happen again with two things in the sort of indie gaming sphere, and it was Frostgrave and Gaslands. And we got to talking about that, Joe and I, about how that unlocked two things. With Frostgrave, my theory was it unlocked the sort of like muffin tin full of old D&D miniatures in the closet that people had. You had this one book where you could go in your sort of like collection of like thrown away toys, cast off miniatures, and instantly have a game that was their home, right? And you saw that in the beginning in Frostgrave. People were digging out old D&D miniatures and putting their own little fellowships of the ring to go and have adventures. And then with Gaslands, it was the same thing. And it unlocked the DNA of that car fan, that kid that played with cars. And people, there was literally pictures of people who were enthusiastic about it right in the beginning, cleaning out whole walls at like Walmart or the pound shop, you know what I mean? Like of toy cars, of like Hot Wheels and stuff like that.
Yeah, children up and down the land were distraught that they couldn't get cars because adults were buying them all and reliving Mad Max on the tabletop.
Exactly. Yeah. And so that conversation got me really interested in, well, what, as a thought experiment, well, what hasn't been done in that regard in like the independent gaming sphere? And I came to the whole like giant robot Gundam mecha modeling genre, because there hasn't been necessarily, there's been games that are in the mecha genre, but they tend to be like small scale games, like 6 mil games, or games that like BattleTech, where you've got a focus on sort of like big stompy robots. And there's so much in the pop culture out there that is robot related. Everything. If you want to go way back to the 80s, you got movies like Robot Jocks, even, where like all of the world's problems are now being solved by giant robot fighting, because war's been abandoned. You have these great like forever running
mangas and anime series.
Robotech, Macross, Gundam Wing, the million different Gundam shoot-offs like Iron Blooded Orphans and stuff like that. And what I wanted was that same sort of like experience where you might have a shelf full of things already. Like there's already Facebook groups of people repainting Hot Wheels cars with like hundreds of thousands of people in them. Yeah. But those people are playing a game with them. You know what I mean? And there's the same thing with like people building mecha and Gundam models, like Machine and Krieger Mac kits and stuff like that. But aren't necessarily, there's a few, there have been a few games like I think there was a Mobile Suit something game. There's been a few like indie games and like small published games, published things, but nothing that like was like a published like finished project. And so like, well, let's take a stab at it. And so that was where I came to the idea of like writing the game. And so right from the beginning, my thought was don't create a like universe that people have to buy their like specific things for, make specific things for, give them a sandbox to play in. And so the universe is more of a sandbox, right? All the arcologies that are surviving on Earth are sort of an idea that might be popular in giant robots. So like you can see here, we've got this is a Bolshev mech, and it looks like it could also be an excavator. You know what I mean? Like if you just took the gun off the front, like it could have also been used for some type of industrial purpose, or it's got a really like stable, strong multi-limb design, and it's very industrial looking, and that's just a look in mecha modeling, right? If you look at the Machine and Krieger stuff, it all looks like that. All the dust stuff looks like that because it's all set in like a mechanized World War II. Like you could find a home in that arcology basically for your model collection. And the same went for the stuff for the Berg. The Berg is this like scientific enclave that are genetically altering humans. So more of a like Blade Runner kind of thing. You can have more sleek, kind of like high tech looking mechs. Hinode is kind of the same idea, more like sleek kind of design. That would be like a Berg mech.
Yeah.
And then you've got North Star, which is the remnants of North American Union, and it's more like traditional, kind of like maybe Pat Labor kind of like mechs. That's a Ghost of Tiamat mech, which is there's an orbital array that was one of the last ditches to repair like the Earth's atmosphere. That was created with nanomachines that were designed to like try and process out all the toxins that have been thrown out there. And it was self-replicating by basically taking the nanomachines would take the junk that was floating around the atmosphere, all of our old satellites and stuff, and strip them down and make more nanomachines out of them. But eventually they ran out of stuff in the atmosphere. And so they've started coming down to Earth, and the orbital array, it realized it can't fix the planet, but it's still self-replicating. So now it's trying to scrape stuff off of the surface of the Earth itself. And it's basically reactivating all this dead technology. So there's frame crews that don't actually have pilots because it's just the nanomachines basically like automating them. And that was my kind of like junk robot undead sort of idea for the game.
It's a fascinating part in of itself, because when you get the book, the background and history of the world is 3 pages.
Yeah.
It's really light. And sometimes when you see people who've gone into world building like this, they put so much emphasis into it. If you take the likes of BattleTech, I have friends who are BattleTech fanatics, and the books they have are, as thick as I am. Let's put it like that. And it's something I've skirted around the outskirts of BattleTech over the years, and would occasionally play games with them, but I've never got into it because the lore is so dense, and it's a game in itself. Whereas this, you really can pull yourself into this world in very simple steps. First off, it is the world, albeit one that's been somewhat dried up as resources have gone away. And then you have these arcologies.
Arcology,
arcology, where the remnants of civilizations are there, and they will define how people play and how their frames operate within the world, but not so much that you just can't grab something. You can't, I could go and find some dust walkers like a Thor, use that's fine. Some of the tags from Infinity, I could definitely bung those in as lights. scale-wise, even you're not restricted by what your idea of what Gamma Wolves is, because it's so open to interpretation that anybody who wants to get involved can get involved with whatever they happen to either have lying around the house already, or possibly want to go out and get. There have been times on occasion where I haven't bought miniatures, which may surprise some people, because I haven't had a rule set to use them with, although generally I stockpile for future. But the idea, especially nowadays where so many people are working on 3D sculpted stuff and print at home or Patreons, where the esoteric and the unusual that would never have got a foothold 5 years ago even opens up this whole world where you can go, well, I want to play mechs and I have a very defined idea. Maybe somebody's massively into Pacific Rim and they go, oh, I think this would be amazing, and get very inspired by that, or they want to reform a manga or an anime that they've got deeply involved with over the years. Now here is the possibility for them to do that within this sphere.
Yeah, and that was kind of that was by intent. It's hard sometimes to pump the brakes on world building, but because the goal of this thought experiment was give people enough of a framework that they have a sort of a plan, right? Give them a template for, hey, go fill in this blank, but don't give them so much that they can't expand their imagination into it, right? They can't fill up their own corner of the Gamma Wolves universe with their imagination. To me, that's always been the magic of miniature wargaming, is that you are creating your own corner of a universe. And one of the things that I think has been not necessarily a failing, but a danger of ever expanding your IP is you fill in too many of the holes. You had Star Wars do that over the years, right? Where you fill in too much of the unknown and people stop imagining. They stop fantasizing of, well, what did that guy mean? What is this guy's story? I think the most iconic example of that probably in pop culture is Boba Fett. He was a 3-line masked space knight, right? That had I think 14 minutes of on-screen time or something like that in the entirety of the first 3 Star Wars movies.
A lot of that was in the background,
and most of it was in the background, and was this absolute fascination for a generation of young people, right? And then as soon as you got his story, it didn't matter what his story was.
It was never going to live up to what people imagined his story to be.
Exactly. And that was kind of foremost in my mind when I was writing the rules for the arcology and the background of the story, was don't spend too much time on it. Spend more time making the stuff people can build and do feel like it fits that template as well, than expanding that template of and then in this year these people went to war and this person rose up to power inside the Burg. I don't want to give names to even the powers inside the arcologies right now, because I want people to be able to name their own pilots and name their own factions and name their own, you know what I mean? Like there's a danger as soon as you put a face to things that people feel forced to
compelled to use them.
Exactly. And I'd much rather, especially right in the beginning, have people just go completely wild with their imaginations and see where that goes.
I think that's one of the things that I found very attractive about it as well. You have these I suppose there's the 4 arcologies plus then the Ghost of Tiamat fluttering around the atmosphere somewhere, but there are the free cities where you've got Ronin. So you have these frames that aren't connected to any of the main hubs, the main remnants of nations, so to speak. And in that, there's an awful lot of scope for exploration.
That's actually where I'm starting. It's funny because that felt like me a safe space to build, because they weren't the 4 primary nations. I could expand and have adventures in the free stations, because they are these pirate sort of bays, you know what I mean? They're essential basically to the world economy. They're essential to the survival of the Gamma Wolf crews out there, because they're the ports of call in between the major arcologies, and they have the ability to refit you, get you fuel, whatever it is. But they're also a bit disposable, so it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if I blow one up at some point, maybe, or name a bunch of people in them and then kill them all off. That they felt like the safe spaces for me to create in, because one, there's this life is cheap mentality, of course, out in the Sea of Destruction, and 2, they can be anywhere and anybody can make up their own free station, right? And even have their arcology crew roughly based out of a free station, because that's the trading post that they've been told to go and operate out of. So I think that's going to be a lot of fun for people who do want to kind of imagine themselves into this universe. Is your free station could literally be the city you're living in right now. You know what I mean? Some iconic part of the city you're living in right now, a shopping mall that has a big underground station or something like that, or a train station, or a big steel mill that over the last like 300 years has been converted into some type of like salvage bay or something. There's all kind of, sports arena or something like that. There's all kinds of things you could do with that yourself to create your own kind of like imaginary corner of the world.
I think that's a delight in and of itself, that there is so much room for exploration.
And of course, the Ronin are cool too. They get all the veteran pilots and the aces. They're the ones that they get all the cool bucks to spend basically on being cool pilots.
Well, maybe I've been brought up on too many Kurosawa films and that sort of thing. That just the idea of having a Ronin wandering about and slapping everybody down who happens to be getting in their way is
that's right.
A great way to go.
They feel like, to me, the Ronin crew in my head when I was writing, they were basically Spike Spiegel and all the people on the Cowboy Bebop, right? That was to me a Ronin crew, right? They're all outcasts from somewhere and they're out having adventures.
So if you're building your, I'm going to use warband as a default term, and then you're selecting from one of the arcologies, so you're selecting the Berg or whatever, how does that impact what you can and can't have on the tabletop?
Right.
Then? Because
so that's typically, it's going to impact your pilot availability and your frame preferences. And I'm going to open the book to remember what I wrote, because I tend to make things up and then people are like, that's not what he said.
Glad I'm not the only one who makes things up when he talks.
Yeah. So there's two ways of playing game. Well, obviously you can play a one-off pickup game, and you probably want to play a one-off pickup game to absorb the rules initially, because there's stakes then, and there's a campaign. And even a campaign is going to function a lot like a one-off game, but your pool of resources will be slightly different. So in a one-off game, you pick your arcology, and that's going to give you some minimums and maximums for your pilots. And that's typically just like what kind of training for pilots is available. So a Bolshev crew, they're actually fairly well trained, but they're required to take 2 trained pilots. So you can't take a lot of rookies, and you can't take a lot of veterans. You can't skew one direction or another.
Yeah.
And every pilot has a pilot value. So in your games of Game of Wolves, even if you're playing a campaign, you're always assigning 12 pilot value to the table at the very beginning of the game. And in a just a one-off game, that's just the balance of the game. In a campaign game, that's your crew chief not letting you send everybody from the crawler out on every single mission. He's just being like, no, you can't. What are you talking? I'm not going to sit here by myself. Like, there's all kinds of scary stuff out there. Someone's staying behind to protect.
Who's going to drag your worthless hide back when you all get destroyed out in the sea of destruction?
Yeah, exactly. We're not doing this, and someone has to come rescue you if you screw this up. So someone has to stay behind. And every pilot is assigned a pilot value that's effectively the same as their endurance, typically, unless they're an ace. So with the 12 pilot value, a rookie will cost you 2, a trained pilot will cost you 3, and a veteran pilot will cost you 4. So you're basically choosing between 3 veteran pilots and a maximum. So a Ronin crew might often have 3 veteran pilots, up to potentially a skew of rookie pilots. So the North Star team, for instance, could just have 6 rookie pilots. They could send a bunch of young idiots out there and be like, here you go, here's all of our remaining supplies, go try and save the world. They just go and get shot to pieces typically, but they'll have a lot of stuff to carry around. But once you've selected your arcology, you'll have a minimum and a maximum. So the Ghost of Tiamat, for instance, they can't take anything but trained pilots because they're robots. They're not exceptional in any regard, but they're also not rookies, right?
Yeah.
You're always going to have 4 frames typically in a Ghost of Tiamat crew. The Berg, they have a really fixed limit on rookie and veteran pilots because they basically come out of their like grow tanks fully formed and educated. So you might have somebody who's, a little bit slower than everybody else as a rookie, but for the most part, they're going to be trained pilots. And then, unfortunately, they're programmed with a 20-year lifespan. So you don't get a lot of veteran pilots from the Verg. They die off because the scientific community doesn't want them getting any funny ideas about overthrowing their society.
We're all for that.
And so you only get 1 veteran pilot. And that's going to be your mix of people that can then be put into frames to go and pilot in the Sea of Destruction. And then the frames themselves in a campaign game, you pick 6 from your minimums and maximums again. That's based on your arcology. So like Bolshev, for instance, has to have a heavy and a medium. and they have a maximum of 1 light. And those 6 frames are sitting in your frame base. So there's an example of a heavy frame.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful 3D print from Philip Turs on Thingiverse, I think. And these are basically free. You're not going to actually pay for your frames. They just go thrown into your crew bays, or if you're playing a one-off game, you just get to pick them, and it can be any size you want. But the difference now is when you go to actually deploy them to the table in any kind of game, you have a budget of 500 material to take to the game.
Mm-hmm.
Material represents how much your crew chief is willing to risk on any given mission outfitting your frames, because they can't put everything into every game. And so again, that's a balancing factor. And the bigger your frames are, the more your weapons cost in material, because they do more damage. They have more impact on the game.
Sure.
So while you, for instance, a bullshit crew can take a whole bunch of heavy frames, they can take unlimited heavy frames, basically. You're going to be paying out the nose for the weapons outfitting on those frames. And so you might not have all of your hard points filled going into it. Mm-hmm. And even once you start finding cool old tech and having it bolted to your frame, stuff that's like, of a higher quality basically than what can be manufactured now, you might not be able to afford the tax to put that stuff on there. So you find yourself having to balance your budget between taking big, cool frames and the weapons that you're bolting onto them, and then even accomplishing the mission. And to do that, then once you've decided what they look like, or what sizes they're going to be, you take the appropriate base size, and that could be any spectrum of bases you want. I give suggestions in the book, but it's not hard and fast, because the scale of the game really is up to you, and you fill them up with models that you like.
Yeah.
And you can see there's a bunch of different ones, actually 3 different manufacturers. The little guy in the front, he's a Ronin frame. He's from Whisper, which I think you can get from Impact Miniatures right now.
Yeah.
You've got a Xandri 4 mech. I love that little guy. I called him Gremlin, because he's got this cool little like weird face.
Yeah, little smiley triple-eyed face.
Yeah, he's from Xandri 4. And then way up there in the back, that huge big heavy frame is from Immortal Kings, and is a 3D print. So the first 2 you can actually buy cast, and Immortal Kings is selling them cast as well now, but I think you can also get STLs if you're a printer to print that one yourself.
It's an interesting thing that in and of the frames themselves being free allows you so much liberty with how you build your crews up that you can really specifically tailor them to whatever way you want. But what I also like is the frame determines the type of weapons on there in things like Infinity, or even in things like Battletech, to take a mech-based game. If you were buying machine guns, then machine guns were always machine guns and did the same damage, whether it was on a Jenner or an Atlas, whether it was on the smallest, lightest mech or the biggest thing in the world. Whereas you've decided that's not the way that Gamma Wolves will play. If somebody has got a machine gun, then great. That's the biggest rapid-firing solid projectile weapon you can put on this frame, and that changes depending on how big the frame is.
Yeah, Infinity actually tackled that in N4, where they started to change up the stats on tags to represent the idea that yes, a machine gun's a machine gun, but when you make it physically larger, it's going to hurt more. So it wasn't, because there used to be that joke of like you'd see like the old Nomad Lizard.
Yes.
And he would eject his pilot, and the pilot would actually have the same.
Pilot would have the same gun running about.
And you'd be like, which of these 2 guns does more damage?
I've got one sitting there.
Yeah, and that was always the joke. He's like, that does the same damage? That doesn't seem like that makes a lot of sense. And so they actually addressed that in the last edition, which I liked. But that was a way for me to flex. I didn't want to have point values in the game. I wanted that to be a real part of the fun, was loading out your crew each game, because you would see that in movies and you would see that in the pop culture stuff, right? The frame is sitting there in the bay and it's all stripped down. It's just a torso and legs, and they're like loading the arms onto it. There's this huge like rack of like different things in the background. That kind of Armored Core thing where even the video games, like half the fun of the video game is just tinkering with your neck and like putting new arms on and stuff. And so that felt like a good way of handling the flex. And there really is I think when people play the game, they probably won't feel it initially looking at the stat values for the mechs. There really is a very big difference between a light frame and a heavy frame survivability. The heavy frame really relies on its armor. It's terrible at evading and has tons of armor points, but it's really bad at evading, and it doesn't handle well unless you're a veteran. It has too many hard points to be able to fire them all, and it's not not for everybody. So just because you can take 6 heavy frames in a North Star crew with like Pile with the rookies, they don't know what to do with them. They just sit there like lumps, getting their arms and legs shot off eventually, totally unable to like dodge shots. It would be like your kid getting in a dump truck and trying to drive it around. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like he's not getting anywhere. It's just bad.
If you can reach the pedal, he can't see what's going on outside.
Exactly. And so, that's literally what would be happening. And then you've got a veteran in a light frame that actually handles to the point where like you almost can't hit him because he's only moving. It looks like he can't move very far because he only got 2 reactor slots, but he moves so far, it means that he doesn't trigger as much incoming fire from Snapfire because he's only moving twice. Versus a heavy frame can move 6 times, but every time it does, it's triggering Snapfire, and it's not very good at evading. So it can potentially move further because it's got longer legs. Like that just makes sense.
Yeah.
But as it does so, its profile is so big, it's just it takes a ton of incoming fire and just gets shot to pieces.
I think that's
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say that it's an interesting thing that you bring up there, the fact that the light frames can move multiple times like the heavies over a longer distance, but the reactor is what really defines how these frames move. And you have 2 almost resource management mechanics built in that act in very interesting ways. You've got the reactor, which is how many times you can stress out the frame to do things, I suppose. Yep. And then there's also how much stress the pilot can take. And they work complementary to each other throughout the game. So you do have this thing where a big lumbering heavy can fire up the reactor many more times, but each time it's only being able to carry that armor and that weaponry so far. So yes, it can stomp along, but every time it activates, it's getting sort of chipped off. Whereas you do have these little fast, nimble mechs that their reactors are smaller, they're more compact and bijou. They can do what they need to do, but they're not going to do it as often. So do you want to talk about how the stresses work and how you thought about bringing those into play? Because it's unusual to have 2 different mechanics like this in one game. Normally you would see people would have, maybe you'd stress the pilot or maybe you'll stress the machine, but having them both, and from the playthroughs I've seen, it works beautifully to really encapsulate what mech combat is, because it is that man and machine.
Yeah, so one of the things that I took cues from actually in writing Game of Wolves was, and again, I sat back when I started thinking about the idea of, well, what have I seen in all of the movies and comics and books that is really like the feeling I want to capture when you're playing the game? And typically what you would see is you'd see 2 shots. Like if you think of any anime that has giant robots in it, there's 2 shots in every fight. Sometimes you see the pilot in the cockpit going, doing stuff. And sometimes you see the robot actually fighting. And so when I thought about that, I thought, well, there is really 2 things going on here. There's the pilot trying desperately to manipulate this huge weapon that they're sitting in. And then there's the weapon itself trying desperately to do all the things the pilot is trying to make it do. And so those made logical sense to me as resources when I was coming at it. And I liked the idea that this wasn't it wasn't a tank game.
Yeah.
It wasn't an aerospace game. It wasn't a spaceship game. It was kind of all 3 at the same time. And depending upon who you were, what kind of a frame you were piloting, it was kind of what kind of feeling did that thing have. So like a big tracked heavy mech is basically a tank. And you can get the feeling of a tank game, but the faster, dodgier like mechs are more like helicopters. You know what I mean? Like they're moving around more like helicopters and strafing and stuff. And so that was where I felt like mechanically, I wanted there to be sort of a 2-phase system, but both resources could be spent in either phase, just to different effects. So in the maneuvering phase, I guess I should just basically overview the turns.
Yeah.
You have your initiative is basically who's acting first each round. And the initiative is always going to the team that's having to manage the less stuff or is managing their stuff better. And that means the team that has the least frames in contact. So either the smaller team, everybody can see everybody, the smaller team, because they're just managing less people. or the team where some people are hiding and can't be seen by the enemy. So it means you're literally managing your profiles better. Will have initiative every turn, get to act first. And that was like an intentional design thing. I wanted to reward good gameplay, not just a roll off. If it's tied, it comes down to a roll off, but
yeah.
That's where if two forces are equally skilled, then it is luck typically that comes down to break the tie. And then once that's determined, there's two phases that happen: the maneuver phase and the gunnery phase.
Mm-hmm.
But like I said, they're blended, and you mentioned that earlier. And the idea there was you had these two resources, and they typically emphasize in one phase. So the maneuvering phase, the reactors being emphasized, and in the gunnery phase, the pilots being emphasized, their endurance. But both things can also affect the other phases. So when you're maneuvering, your reactor's being heated up, you're using that resource to maneuver the frame around. It's moving to its full effect. But whenever something can see you, the pilot can stress themselves, the enemy pilot can stress themselves to snap fire you and take a quick shot. Mm-hmm. And so you have to balance your decision making in that phase of going back and forth, getting where we need to be, and where are you going to be during the next turn, versus the idea that, well, I can take a quick shot, you're in the open right now, and it might have a really big lasting effect. Mm-hmm. And so where you are in relation to each other has a big effect, and whether or not you can see each other has a big effect later on in the gunnery phase. And that meant that ballet of I move, you move, I move was fairly important. You do get a number of passes equal your difference in frame count, but there aren't a lot. And once you decide you're done maneuvering, you're stuck. You're stuck where you are. You burned all your reactor for the turn. So managing a reactor and during that turn can be a really neat dance.
Yeah.
And once both sides have either run out a reactor to spend or decide they don't want to spend, like they declared, I'm not spending any more reactor, then the opponent, the initiative goes to the gunnery phase, and the opponent who's won the initiative gets to try and fire first. And that's where the pilot stress is emphasized. Mm-hmm. But you do still need a reactor because certain weapons will actually stress the reactor. So most energy weapons, you require a reactor slot to fire. And if you don't have one, you can still fire them, but you start to overheat, you take damage to the body.
Damage on the frame, yeah.
And that means you're still having to kind of think about reactor going into that phase as a resource so you don't blow yourself up.
Yeah. That was the thing that I really appreciated when I was looking at it, was that even though you have the maneuver phase, there are shots coming in, and then you've got the gunnery phase, but people can still try and do a bit of dodge. And it's that balancing act of trying to get the best out of your pilot and your frame to complete the objective, because the objectives are generally you're out looking for old tech that's, much, much preferable to anything that you're currently in. But because you're out from somewhere like an archaeology far away, and they've gone, right, we can possibly give you this amount of fuel and this amount of energy. So the actual stress on the reactor is a ticking clock for your crew as well. And that, when I seen that, I absolutely loved it, because every turn you have to try and cool the reactors down, and all the stress on the reactor that comes off is the war clock. Yeah. And that's how you time your games. And that is genius. I adore that, because you can't push massively hard every turn knowing that there's not going to be any repercussions, because you'll burn your frame out. So you have this balancing act that you need to have enough stress to complete the objective, but you can't play fast and loose. And even when you lose frames from the combat, whatever stress was on their reactor comes off the war clock. So if you're starting with 40, say, or 50, and all of a sudden a light gets knocked off that maybe had 4 or 5 on it, you're not going, well, that's not 5 I have to worry about come the end of the turn. You suffer that. That's your resources for this game. That was a chunk of it gone. That was poor management on your point of view. And that constant ticking clock of what can you do and when should you start to stress things more gives a lovely balance to the play as well.
It was, the idea came from air combat games. The most common war game to use the idea of like a fuel counter or some type of like fuel management is aerospace games, because that is a real concern in all air fights. Bingo fuel is just a thing. The point of no return at which you can't get back to your carrier, you can't get back to whatever. your landing strip.
Mm-hmm.
And so I felt like that was another reason why the setting was actually really important to the game, was the pilots don't want to die. They're not going to just like kill themselves every mission, right? And so it needed to be a point of no return at which they just pull back and go like, nope, we can't stay. We have to go. We're going to die out here in the dark if we don't like bug out now. And again, it's an inherent balancing factor, and was a reason why I was able to make the frames free.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because if you take 6 heavy frames in a Bolshevik crew, or 4 or whatever, you have a potential war clock tax of 24 per turn, right? You're bleeding off 24. If you're using all your reactor every turn with your heavy frames, and an average game is 40 war clock, you're getting 2 turns of operation in the theater before you're actually like having to pull out. Which is either moving less and using less stressful weapons, or you're having to like soak up things with your armor by just sitting still. So your option then is I have 2 maybe of my heavy frames just hull down in cover trying to take shots at people, while the other 2 are going out and having to rely on their armor to try and actually accomplish the mission. And so it meant that crews could play really differently, and people could select the models they liked, but they're signing up for the disadvantage, right? When you hand the player the responsibility of the advantages and disadvantages, they don't feel good or bad about it because they signed up for it. They go, well, I made this decision, so yeah, I clocked out again, and I only got 2 pieces of stuff, but my big frames look really cool, right? Like,
and isn't that what we all want at the end of the day? It's massive stompy robots kicking each other.
Yeah. And that was again another sort of like inherent design thing. One, it means that you're not able to sort of like alpha strike. Like I didn't want there to be a big like emphasis either on like overclocking the mechs and trying to design a perfect mech that could like fly across the table and just kill somebody. Without having a repercussion where you did that, great, but then like 2 turns later, he's got 4 half-broken frames on the table, but you clocked out, so he gets all the prizes that are left on the table because you had to bug out because you went too hard and then left. Spent it all.
It's funny you mentioned cover, because one of the things that there isn't in this game is a lot of terrain rules and cover rules. There's 3 types of terrain: open, impassable, and then an intermediary where it sort of slows people down. And I love that because there's a few games I play where they work on the principle that these are fighters, whether they're trained soldiers or they're robots or whatever it happens to be. But there's no point in putting in additional cover rules because they would be using the cover they have anyway. They wouldn't be standing skylined. And instead you've gone the other way where there's no negative or there's no negative for firing past cover, but there's a bonus for when somebody is out in the open. So it's always assumed that people are always making the best use of dips in the ground or bits of buildings or whatever else they happen to be moving around. And that frees things up an awful lot for gameplay.
There's another layer to that too, where that was again an intentional decision. I don't like rewarding inactivity in any game. As a designer, inactivity shouldn't be rewarded. Activity and decision making should be rewarded. And I don't like a lot of cover rules that reward the inactive player for sitting still and not doing anything, or buying a disadvantage for their opponent. It doesn't feel good. You have your opponent, through nothing you can control, be able to buy out an advantage over you. It's a gameplay experience that isn't typically rewarding for the inactive player. It does feel good for the active player to be able to buy an advantage over their opponent. And typically it feels less poor for the person on the receiving end, right? Because the person on the receiving end, when the inactive player has an advantage, you feel like you don't have franchise as the active player. But when the active player does something that gets you in the open, all of a sudden, you go, you got me, and you don't feel quite as bad about it. And so when I had the ideas of obscuring cover, it's rooted in what you just talked about, where these are highly sophisticated fighting machines, and these pilots understand the idea of being in cover. And so you don't need to reward them doing the thing that they just do naturally. But I wanted to reward good maneuvering, because if the emphasis of both turns was on this kind of ballet of movement, then catching someone in the open or catching someone in the flank and the rear felt like the place where you had the bonuses. And so you just flip the concept. Don't apply penalties to the active player. give them potential bonuses.
Yeah.
And that makes it a more rewarding play experience for both people, because it's based on something they can control. No player can control, hey, we set up the board, then we randomly roll off to see who approaches, and you got to decide all the terrain. So now I'm at a disadvantage through nothing I can control.
Yeah.
But both sides can control maneuvering to try and get to each other's flanks and rears. And so it gives the players a bit more franchise in that bonus.
Which is always nice to see. At the end of the day, war games are about tactics and maneuver. Fire maneuvers is what we want to see and not just gun lines, static gun lines. Oh my God. Yeah. No.
Yeah. That's why everybody talks about World War II, doesn't talk about World War I. World War I was a boring hide in holes and shell each other.
Yeah. We're going to sit here for the next 3 months until we run out of ammo, and then we'll advance.
That's right, yeah.
But on the subject of ammo, it's a D6 based game where successes can be used both to damage and to modify where the damage is going, which again is another cute little baked in rule where you've taken, rolls to hit and gone, okay, well, there's going to be a location, and you can weigh up whether or not dumping a load of damage onto that location is a good thing, or potentially taking some of the successes away to modify where you're hitting. And again, that has a real mech warrior combat feel to it, where you're going, well, I could chop off that arm, but that arm's got a missile launcher that he's already fired the missile out of, so it's pointless. But instead, I'll spend 2 of the successes and modify and move that. And it gives you this tracking, the sort of grid feel, where you're trying to pick out specific targets, which is a really interesting concept.
Well, you want to feel like you're piloting, right? That's again, that comes down to how you insert things into the rules of a game that makes you feel like you're sitting inside the robot, and being able to like go and move the damage over somewhere is one of those things where you now feel like you're actually holding the throttle. You know what I mean? Like you're holding the controls.
Yeah, especially for things like laser beam weapons, where they don't get that big spike of damage that a lot of the other weapons.
They all have multipliers. Yeah, they do damage multiplier. Yeah, so everybody has a damage multiplier except for a beam weapon. It does a huge spike of flat damage, but that frees you up to use the success to scalpel off the sensors or scalpel off an arm, and that felt like a neat way of making it different.
Yeah,
have it do like a really big damage spike, but then let them freely use successes to like track it around. Because if you ever see lasers in most fiction and like Star Wars blasters, I don't even know if they're lasers. Are they shooting energy packets? Like what are they doing? Or like G.I. Joe lasers where it's just shooting fuse.
Yeah,
it's really how lasers work. The best film I ever saw with lasers in it was actually Akira, where Kaneda's got the laser at the end, and it's just this like line, and it just saws things in half. And that was the laser I was going for in Gamma Wolves, where all the energy weapons are just these like static lines of laser energy, that it's almost like you're using like a saw to just go and just like slice something off, or a huge knife.
Just going full gold finger on your opponent.
Exactly, yeah. And
so I expect you to die slowly up.
And that was one of the fun things in games is once you come up with a mechanic like damage tracking, is how can you insert it into the various other weapon systems to make them all feel different and feel unique. And then you start coming up with tags to make things feel a little bit more special, right? So like if you look at the smaller weapons or the rapid fire weapons, the more dice you have, the lower your damage multiplier tends to be. But then you can also have that offset, like all the autocannon weapons, which is just a catch-all term for automatic rapid firing solid shells, have the assault rule, which means if you roll a whole bunch of 6s in your dice pool, they're all doubling up for hits. So that means you've managed to do that thing where you just land a whole bunch of bullets in the right spot all at once, or you've tracked enough, you have the successes to go and track it around. Your damage multiplier being low becomes less of an issue because you can just catch them with a whole bunch of shot at once. And then vice versa, you've got weapons like the shot cannon that are really firing this huge cluster of shrapnel, and they make it harder to dodge. So once you're in optimum range, it's not doing more hits, but because it's penalizing your opponent's dodge, it nets into more hits in the end because they cancel less successes typically when they hit you.
Yeah, because it's a lot of opposed dice rolls for.
It's opposed or unopposed. And that's the thing is, again, the opposition to the dice pools is another resource management, because you can also hold your pilot's endurance to evade, and you only get to evade for free during the maneuvering phase. All the evades during the gunnering phase cost you pilot endurance. So if your rookie pilot is like holding on to the trigger, waiting for his time to shoot and lining it up, his mech is just taking damage from all these unopposed dice pools.
Yeah.
Like just gets like shot, and then like waits for his turn to fire. Because he's just not good.
Sometimes it's whether or not you're steady enough.
Mm-hmm.
It's whether they can grit it out and take the damage. And that, again, that's something that when people are playing, it offers a choice. And having choices in a game where you're not just going, well, he's going to fire at me, therefore I'm going to take the damage and hopefully I'll make whatever saves I have. Whereas you've going, well, if I push now, then maybe later I can't dodge, or it's going to affect my gunnery later on. And everything is a choice, and every choice requires more tactical insight. And as people start to play, I can't imagine a lot of people jumping around factions early on, where they're changing what their crews are loaded with all the time. Instead, I can see people focusing in on building the lance that they want to see, and then really learning how to use it and learning where the stresses are and where those break points are, because the campaign system allows you to level up those rookie pilots as well, and gain some tactical knowledge with them as you play, and then get to better levels up to sort of legendary fighters.
Yeah, and I think there's going to be a rewarding aspect to that too, where like you get your Spike from Robotech, where he's a rookie ace. You know what I mean? He's good at doing one thing, but he's not really good at everything.
Yeah.
And then leveling him up to being like a legendary fighter pilot. Or you get your Roy Fokker, who's already pretty good, but then by the end of it, he's just this incredible like legendary super fighter. And to me, that was the point of a campaign system, because the giant robot drama is never really about the robots. The robots are always about the journeys of the people inside them and stuff too. And so there's the mech combat games, the mechs are there, but they're like a suit of armor for the person inside them. And so having them become more interesting through bolting old tech on them was important. But there's enough choice in Game Wolves, I think, that people are going to enjoy, I think, tweaking their frames to the point where there's lots to do there. So making them better inside, making their brain better, that means making the palette better. And that was where the campaign system, I thought, was an important aspect. And I wanted to not just do a robot combat game. I wanted to do one where there is some sort of like some gravity to losing your mech, because the guy inside could be dead or he could get twitchy, or, you know what I mean, or injured or whatever. And there's a long-term effect basically for him going back out there.
Yeah, and you have a little optional rule even where pilots can eject. Which amuses me, because I remember anytime a pilot ejected in Battletech, the first thing that would happen was people would try and shoot the cockpit out of the air as it went whizzing off. It's just like, how quickly can I kill that pilot? Because it was always about the pilots in Battletech as well. It's anybody can get in a mech and run it around and trigger the guns, but the quality of the person who's doing it is the most important thing. And when you've been playing with a crew for a while and you've got those pilots in those mechs who are particularly good, you want to keep them alive. You don't want to see some Ronin come out of nowhere and take the head straight off somebody, because there are pilot injuries in there if you're unfortunate enough for that to happen.
And fighting to the death isn't realistic in any game. I think we're very used to every game being
the Pyrrhic victory.
You know what I mean, every game is Leonidas and his 300 going out to die, and it's like, you might not want to all die. That might not go well. You might want to.
Have you thought about living?
Yeah, have you thought about not dying in your game? And to me, the nice thing about a game like Game Wolves is you can inherently make everything really tough. Even the lights are really hard to kill in one go. Yeah, like it would be almost impossible to kill most frames, except for in like exceptional circumstances in like a single hit. Like if a heavy got on a light that was out of maneuvers and like hit it with like a melee weapon and got all hits, you could probably crush that thing in one go. But it's like, you're talking about like that perfect storm of like his back is turned, he doesn't see the hammer come down, and then just gets like clocked into the ground like Daffy Duck.
He's like, ran all the way across the table and spun around, presenting his rear deliberately, perhaps as a distraction for the rest of the crews to do the mission.
you've earned that stupid death, basically.
Yep. You really have to go out your way for it.
Yeah, and so I think that like that again, having that time to make those decisions is an important thing too. Like having that time to, feel like I took a bunch of damage, but I'm holding in there. I'm okay. Like just holding there a little bit longer. That was an important part of it as well. And then even those optional rules allow you to have things happen. Like if a frame's pilot is injured to the point where they're no longer able to survive, and the frame goes inactive, the frame's still there.
Yeah.
Like it's still sitting on the table. And someone in a light frame could just eject and jump into it and pilot it and like get it off the table. Like there's all kinds of things you could do, mechanically speaking. Will they work? Are they risky? Of course they're risky. They might not work, but like I wanted that to be a fun, exciting possibility that you could have in your games if you played them long enough.
Yeah. I want to see the recovery missions where an additional pilot is brought in and just one massive frame in the middle of the tabletop.
I've got a bunch of ideas for not writing too many missions is also the hard thing for an initial rock, because the problem with writing too many missions is inevitably some of them are going to be crap and be way too asymmetrical. And so I boiled it down to 6 kind of iconic actions that a frame crew might take during these like salvage missions. But I have a ton more in my head because there's so many that are like in pop culture that you want people to be able to try and be able to experience.
Yeah.
It was the same when I was writing Last Days. There's so many zombie movies and so many like situations you can be in a zombie movie. It was hard to like boil it down to like just a few initially. And there's other things too. Like I really want to do I've got 2 streams of ideas for like solo play content. Cause I wrote this in 2018 when we weren't all in lockdown. And so solo content was something people started asking for this year. Yeah. As the book was starting to come out, I was like, oh God, there's nothing in there. Like there's multiplayer stuff, but there's nothing in there for solo play. But again, the giant robot genre actually can really lean into that if I wanted to. And so I've got 2 streams of content. One is kind of like a isomorphic top-down shooter style game where you're running a single frame of your design and there's lots of AI controlled little monsters running towards you, kind of like those old arcade games like Midway 1942 where the plane's flying around and like stuff is just flying into it and it's all super easy to kill, but like you're having to deal with like tons and tons of them. And it would be like a lone wolf kind of an idea where someone's gotten cut off and they're trying to fight their way back to the frame and there's tons of little like critters attacking them, a metal slug sort of a thing. And then I had ideas for just like full on AI rules for opposing forces and giving example forces and how they would operate.
Just setting the Ghost of Tiamat on everybody.
Well, that's it. And I've got my MacGuffin already built in. Yeah, right. Yeah. My little Metroids, right? My little Metroids can run towards you and get blown.
Well, I was going to ask then, are these plans going to come forward in a supplement in the future, or is this something that you're going to use or release through the things like the Facebook group or through Blaster? Because I'll probably
release them through, not necessarily through Blaster, but with Blaster, because we've got a great team of artists and designers in Blaster that like we've kind of become one of those little like what do they call it in Silicon Valley? A incubator. Oh, yes. We're sort of an idea incubator now, and we all have various types of talents. Like we're all kind of pushed into different directions as far as like our main strengths, and that's been really good because it's given all 5 of us additional resources to kind of draw upon. And so what'll probably end up happening is some of it will probably end up being in Blaster at some point. But Blaster is kind of the home of ideas too crazy for for mainstream, or that like it don't add up necessarily initially to like a big supplement that someone like Osprey would publish. And the thing with publishing through a main publisher like Osprey is it takes a lot of time. Yes. Like if I was to start writing solo rules right now, they'd come out 2 years from now. Whereas
they don't exactly turn on a dime.
They'd come out in 6 months if I'm writing them now through doing it myself, right, or 3 months even. And that to me was an important part too, is how much do I want to start doing on my own and how much do I want to start doing through Osprey? So doing like a big title, like the main book and stuff through Osprey, I think is super useful just because they can make an incredibly beautiful product that is well supported and can go into any bookstore. So you can go and get it at Kohl's, or you can get it at Barnes & Noble in the US, or you can get it at, Chapters Indigo in Canada. but then there's that, I want more stuff to come out faster for it going forward. And so they have a million projects they're working on. They're not going to make time for my supplement where you're playing a top-down arcade game. they just can't.
Shame.
So doing it myself just makes more sense, I think.
It'll be fascinating to see where that sort of comes out in the long run as well. Because the Facebook group, I think it's safe to say, blew up from when it first got announced.
Yeah.
Because I remember getting the little message from Osprey going, "This is coming out soon. Here's a 19-page PDF of the background and a bit about the mechanics." And then shortly after that, the Facebook group was in triple figures.
Yeah.
And I thought it's beyond that now. It's into thousands.
It's like 1,300 or something like that. I think there was about 900. There was about 700 or 800 people before we did the announcement. And I think it's like 1,300. It's almost doubled. I think it's almost doubled in size in like the last 3 months or something like that.
Which shows the expectation, I suppose, that this is a genre that needed exploited, because I've seen other games that have been running for longer, and the buy-in, if you will, and Facebook isn't a great metric, but seeing how long it takes them to reach 1,000 people as a milestone takes much longer. And maybe it's because they're trying to enter an oversaturated market already, whereas Gamma Wolves has this lovely little niche all of its own in the corner, where people were going, "I really want mechs. I really want to play with whatever I want." But that doesn't exist currently, and now it does. So I have to say, if people aren't in the face page group, it's worth joining, because there's an awful lot of back and forth in there as well, and people's ideas are exceptional. And it's amazing what happens when you just sort of sprinkle the surface of the border with some breadcrumbs and then see what gets attracted to come and feed.
Especially if you're thinking, I'd like to play this game and I don't know where I'd get models. I think the number one thing probably going on in the Facebook group right now is being like, I found this, I found this, I found this, I found this. And people just like jumping on it. Yeah. Because there's so much out there. There's so much out there that's just this incredible like spectrum of everything from like action figures, like large scale and small scale action figures, to Gunpla and like the Gundam style like mecha modeling kits, to like bespoke resin kits, like the Calamity resin kits and Mac resin kits that are available for robots are just incredible. To people doing it in 15 mil and deciding like, hey, we're just going to play it. We have great 15 mil mech collections already. Yeah. What would I want to do to try and play it in the scale, and then converting it and doing it themselves. And that was entirely the goal. So I'm really happy about that. Yeah. That people, it's just watching that stuff percolate, and then people finally playing the game once they've kind of finished that percolation that's the most rewarding thing for a game designer. And that to me was the culmination of the thought experiment, does giving people that sandbox to play in unlock that creativity. And that's all I wanted. Like I'm going to keep playing it and making stuff for it. But that, as far as I'm concerned, the mission's already accomplished in that it unlocked that level of like enthusiasm for people creating and making stuff for themselves and making their own little like corner of the world. And that's what makes me happy as a game designer. Yeah. I don't want people to want me to tell them what to do in their hobbies. I just want to give people an excuse to be excited about their hobbies. And that seems to be what's happening.
I think it's safe to say that Gamma Wolves has already achieved that goal. So it's just now we have to sit back and wait to see where it goes and where the community take it and what comes in future. If people are interested in seeing more about Gamma Wolves, like I say, there's the Facebook group, Guerrilla Miniature Games. If you're on this channel, I dare say you already know that channel exists. If not, go over, give it a sub, because Ash does some fantastic battle reports across a whole wealth of genres and styles of games. So you'll find a great book flip through with some of Ash's ideas on the design behind there, along with, I think there's 2 battle reports up at the moment.
There was a first look that we did when we did the play testing. So right after we stopped playing it with Lego, because that was our initial play test stuff, was we bought a bunch of Lego mechs on Amazon and played it with that. When we were actually painting robots, we decided to give it a go and play the game on video. And it's probably 2 years old now. And then I did a Let's Play overviewing the mechanics when I did the author's notes last week. So that was there's a current actually out of the rulebook version. The original first look is like probably the beta draft of the rules. It's like 2 years old. It might not be exactly what is in the rule book now. I don't remember what we changed.
It's the problem with living with something for 2 years, I suppose.
Well, that's it. I opened the book when I got my author's copies, and I opened the book and I was like, "This is really well written. Who wrote this?"
Did I have a ghostwriter? I can't remember.
I don't remember writing this at all. That's really good. I like that. It's funny because I think people, once you've written a lot, and I'm at this point in my life written a lot, both in school and then for work. I worked for Games Workshop for 15 years and did a lot of writing with them, training and sort of like backgroundy stuff for working there. And then now writing stuff for myself, writing games. You do like, it is a bit fire and forget sometimes. And it is funny because I think a lot of times authors will get asked questions about the things they've written. And we get this really disappointing blank look on our face where we're like,
did we? Did
I see
that? I don't think I did. Oh, no, but it's right here in this book. Oh, really? Okay.
And then you realize 2018 Ash had a lot to say about a certain thing that 2020 Ash has no recollection of at all.
Well, it's been a pleasure sitting down and talking with you. If anybody has any questions, if you drop them below, and I shall do my best to get answers for you from Ash. But until then, bye-bye.
Go ahead and check out our other content on screen now. And while you're at it, why not hit subscribe and remember to ding our dong. Go on, you know you want to click it. Go on.